Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to the YouTube channel. My name is Furkhan Dandia, and I want to talk about something that I've thought about quite a bit, and it's the epidemic of virtue signaling in Islam and why we are warned against hypocrisy. This may seem like a hot take, but my frustration with virtue signaling started many years before I even knew what it meant. Growing up, I often experienced this sentiment when I watched religious quote unquote people behave in ways that contradicted what they were preaching. And as a Muslim, I have usually observed people praying for the outward demonstration rather than what the true meaning of prayer is. Again, I don't say this in a judgmental way. It is an issue that I've observed. And then I used to get scolded by the elders around me for not praying. On a deeper level, I question being the object of their discontent. And then I would also ponder about the act of prayer and other inconsistent behaviors. For example, there's a lack of humility through grandiose behavior, seeking social status, talking behind people's backs and putting them down, or judging others and looking down on them. So all of these things were something I observed in the culture, but then they did not align with what I had understood from the text. As I continued to grow older and interacted with the real world, the internal conflict I was feeling perpetuated further. And then I struggled to comprehend how people continue to judge and shame others through their self righteousness and perceived higher moral standards. This predicament confronted me during my first marriage. As I sought a potential partner, part of the pressure I experienced from my family was finding someone with the same religious background. Although I did not see the merit to that argument, in retrospect, it does make sense to me now as I have made progress spiritually. However, the marriage was mired in turmoil, which personally made me question religion and the people who claim to be religious and the whole existence of God. I have talked about this dilemma many times on my podcast, and I also have other videos where I talk about this. But often people will experience religious trauma based on the actions of people who represent a religion, and often people then end up resenting God. And the same sentiment applies to acts of oppression in the name of God. So I just, again, removing ourselves from what these people are claiming or objective behind that behavior. I think once we're able to separate that, we can see that they're also misled or they're misleading themselves. So the complexity of virtue signaling and understanding people's motives is equally perplexing. It is perhaps why I chose to enter into the therapy world on a subconscious level. First of all, I just want to define what virtue signaling is. I've looked at several definitions, but the one in the Merriam-Webster stood out to me the most. It's defined as the act or practice of conspicuously displaying one's awareness of and attentiveness to political issues, matters of social and racial justice, etc., especially instead of taking effective action. The crucial point here is instead of taking effective action, which was the most problematic for me to reconcile. And I believe it is the most frustrating part of all this that people such as myself struggle with. It is the narcissistic tendency for people to act and speak with grandiosity without the action to back it up. So this air of self-righteousness or moral superiority can be sickening. But then my compassionate side sees it as a call for attention to prove that one is a good person. Unfortunately, especially in the age we live in, the world of social media, it has become an epidemic with many people putting their virtuous acts on and words on display. And then often these people show a demonstration on their social media accounts without ever stepping out of their homes. And majority of the times it's their parents' home. So how does then one make sense of all of this and return to a path of spiritual growth? For me personally, I started to read history and biographies and realized that these character traits have existed throughout human existence and often result from envy. There is the story in the Quran as well. It's a biblical story too, the Cain and Abel story there of envy. And how does envy lead people to display their virtue without actually taking action? Because action requires effort and discipline, especially when it requires one to live with integrity and the truth. It is much easier to talk a big game and direct envy toward those taking action without grandstanding. And when I'm faced with that conflict, I will often reflect on Teddy Roosevelt's speech the man in the arena. I'm not going to quote all of it, but a very important part of it is, I will quote here, it is not the critic that counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds would have done better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena. So there's too many examples of people showing up and putting in the work without making a big scene of it. And the same applies to one's belief in a higher power of God. How one chooses to make that spiritual connection is one's personal choice. That's my view. It should not be up to us mere mortals who have no clue what happens after we perish. We all have an idea, but we don't know for sure. But we seem to judge and decide what the correct way is to connect to God. Now, the Islamic faith makes a clear distinction between the ones who believe and the ones who claim to believe. And often that is translated to hypocrites in the English language. Interestingly enough, virtue signaling and hypocrisy go hand in hand, but it is a phenomenon we must observe as it is all around us. And to bring the frustration full circle, I finally found my answers when I sat down with the Quran openly and humbly. As many people have reported, we do not read the Quran, reads us based on the state of our hearts and spiritual health. So I didn't have to look far, as the second surah in the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, identifies the issue of hypocrisy and addresses it from the beginning. So I'm going to read some verses here of the English translation of Surah Al-Baqarah from verse 5 to 15. And this is the English translation. It is they who are truly guided by their Lord, and it is they who will be successful. As for those who persist in disbelief, it is the same whether you warn them or not, they will never believe. Allah has sealed their hearts and their hearing, and their sight is covered. They will suffer a tremendous punishment. And there are some who say, we believe in Allah in the last day, yet they are not true believers. They seek to deceive Allah and the believers, yet they only deceive themselves, but they fail to perceive it. There is sickness in their hearts, and Allah only lets their sickness increase. They will suffer a painful punishment for their lies. When they are told, do not spread corruption in the land, they reply, we are only peacemakers. Indeed, it is they who are the corruptors, but they fail to perceive it. And when they are told, believe as others believe, they reply, will we believe as the fools believe? Indeed, it is they who are fools, but they do not know. When they meet the believers, they say, we believe. But when alone with their evil associates, they say, we are definitely with you, we were only mocking. Allah will throw their mockery back at them, leaving them to continue wandering blindly in their defiance. So when I read those words, and even reading them now, it does shake me to my core, if I'm being completely honest, but it has also brought me peace and contentment for myself. And while this has helped me, I'm not suggesting that this is the prescription for everyone. However, if one does investigate and absorb these words, there is a powerful message that addresses the issue of virtue signaling and offers a prediction. Now, as I've continued to navigate the complexities of life and the chaos this world offers, I have often returned to the Quran for guidance and peace. This approach has also reinforced that I need to keep living the truth to the best of my ability and do the right thing because it is the only way to live, whether I observe a reward or not. Therefore, doing the right thing is not about publicly displaying it, but it is something one does for oneself, for one's own peace and contentment. And as I've also learned from the words of C.S. Lewis, integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. So I hope this was useful as I've shared some personal experiences and how I've navigated it. But if you also find yourself confused and often wondering, trying to reconcile this whole idea of virtue signaling and how people would say something, but then do the opposite, that is cognitive dissonance. And unfortunately, they do struggle with that. But we've been given a book, fortunately, to reflect and look back on if we are struggling with this. So I hope you can find the answers you may be looking for. They are not far. And if you enjoyed this, please subscribe.